Um, so I'll just give a quick introduction on me. My name is Brad Beck. I'm licensed here in the state of Illinois. I'm NCARB certified construction document technologist, and I am Autodesk certified associate and professional for Revit 2012. I went to school at the University of Cincinnati for both my master's degree and my bachelor's degree. I've been out of school for 12 years working on all different project types, mainly focused on multifamily until what you'll see later is the museum that I worked on for the past 3.5 years. But 15 years of experience working with Autodesk products because I worked on it while I was in school as well as sometime in high school. So I've been working with Autodesk for a while. 6 years of experience working specifically on Revit projects, and then 3 years teaching Revit to different firms and helping consult with different firms on their BIM needs. So to start this off, we're going to talk a little bit here about the executives portion of training. And for the most part, when I'm doing an executives training session, it's really more about managing BIM users than it is about teaching BIM to executives, because typically the executives aren't going to be opening up any BIM products. They're not going to be opening up Revit and looking through models. They're going to be really just managing the BIM users and understanding. They need to understand the mindset that the users are in. Architects typically are on-the-job learners, and they're not necessarily into thinking about what training means and what the psychology of training is. And so the managing BIM users for executives is really about getting them to understand that mindset and to step out of the let's throw people into the fire and let them, figure it out, and really understand what training's all about. And so what you'll see here is sort of the beginning of or parts of my first hour of presentation that I give to them. I go through a quick explanation of building information modeling, and on the top here is the National BIM standard, but below that I put a little bit easier to understand definition, where a building information model is really just a database of information, and it's represented three-dimensionally so that it can easily convey all of your design intent, and it's easy to use for coordination during construction, for contractors, for trades, as well as for managing the final facility. And that's sort of the simplest definition I can give of building information modeling. The integrated project delivery process, this is a sort of effort and time diagram that put together really to explain what happens when you're moving from a 2D world to a 3D world and the type of information you need for that building information model and when you need it. The whole purpose of the software is to get all of your information and all of your decisions made before the start of construction so that it doesn't cost as much money while you're building it to change something. So that's what the benefit of the software really is, and as you can see here, by moving that to more front-loaded towards the design development, schematic design, your ability to control the cost is a lot higher, and so you're saving a lot more money in the long run by doing that. The project delivery process itself is harnessing the talents of everybody that's involved in the project. So you want to make sure you have contractors on board from the very beginning in order to really get the integrated project delivery process going and maximize your efficiency for all of the phases of design. With building information modeling, most of the softwares allow you to incorporate your media all into one location. So you're looking at your plans, you're looking at your 3D views, your renderings, even the models that you build can be printed from that 3D model all in one file, all with one software. So the bigger projects then aren't necessarily one file, but it's still relatively small compared to what we were doing with AutoCAD and having XREFs and tons of different files.
And I think that kind of gets to the point as it relates to sort of explaining BIM to executives. It starts to kind of get into the value proposition, right? Why is firm leadership going to be interested in working in BIM?
Yeah, so this is a big benefit of any BIM software, let alone just Revit. But Revit is what I'm trained in, and so most of these views are from Revit. One of this view here is just to sort of show executives when I go through it what the benefit is for coordination. This is all of the architectural finishes on a very specific part of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights that I worked on. And it's sort of a worm's eye view looking up, but we were very specifically looking at a headroom issue on this ramp that's right here. And as we brought in the structure, we could see where the structure was coming across, and we were going to have an issue when we brought in the mechanical with the headroom. And so we did a WebEx with the firms in Toronto. The mechanical and structural engineers were in Toronto. The architect of record was in Winnipeg, and we were in Chicago. And so this is just sort of gives you a quick overview of the benefit of what this software can do. For the process, you're really streamlining everything you're doing. So this is a view of the actual structural model, and then that was handed off. This was a Tekla version of it that was handed off to the steel fabricator. They came in, designed all the connections, and actually right in here you can see some of these gusset plates got in the way of one of our doors in the concrete core, and we were able to flag that ahead of time and move that door out of the way so that that connection can still be there. So these are just some of the benefits. Quickly, this is just a view of the structural model beforehand, and this is a view of that same area, basically taking in the same spot, but on site. So you can see the benefit here of being able to see those things ahead of time. So here I'm going to go through some slides and talk about quickly what the benefit of that individual slide is. I'm not really going to read everything on the slide, but for executives, when I go through here, I try to speak to each point. But for training, because architects generally have not really thought about the psychology of training, I go through and I explain people who are getting trained experience a bunch of different things: excitement, skepticism, frustration, and then finally an epiphany where they understand what they're doing. The benefit and the purpose of what the executives need to do is to really support everybody through that frustration phase and get them past it so that they can reach their epiphany. Training is generally a supplement to experience, so much like anything, you can learn something real quickly and then you leave and you go to do it in the real world, and it takes a bit longer for you to really become a power user, and that's what training really is. It's just a jump start. Executives want to take advantage of the questions that are going to be asked by all the junior staff when they start using building information modeling software, because you need to understand how buildings go together when you start building a virtual model. And so they're going to ask tons of questions about how the buildings go together, and executives need to support that and say, ask as many questions as you need, because the more you know about it, the more the whole knowledge base in the office goes up. Is BIM easy? Well, this slide's really just about, most executives have seen tons of dog and pony shows about how great BIM is, and it is great, but there are some downsides as well. Most executives that I've spoken to think you can just cut a section in a building and you're done, and for some reason they think that the software has designed all those connections for you and you just zoom in and you've got a detail, and that's not necessarily the case. So it's really about managing expectations at this point to say, look, there are things you can do and there are things that don't work the way you want them to, so you need to work around that. The guidelines are very important. Setting up lists about what's due, when it's due, what your scope is. Also, the biggest thing I think with any BIM software is the amount of information that it requests to the user at the very beginning of the project can be overwhelming for someone who doesn't really know what they're doing and hasn't done it before. So setting expectations and guidelines for how much information goes into that model is really important for any firm, and so the executives are really on the front line of that, setting up those guidelines and understanding what needs to be done and when. For the first several projects, and this is something I get a lot of pushback from executives on, the first couple of projects you are not going to increase your profitability. And I know I don't hear a lot of people saying that out in the real world, or people who are selling don't really say that. But the reality is you may be able to break even or meet the same profit that you were before and get it done in the same time that you were with a 2D program for the first couple of projects. You probably won't lose money, but you're probably not going to make more money than you did before. And so it's important to manage that expectation and say, look, until all of your users are power users, it's going to take you a while to start gaining the benefit of the software. But once you start gaining the benefit of the software, it's huge. So just this is sort of helping the executives through the frustration phase and saying, just keep on it and you'll get there. 3 or 4 projects, I think, typically that a team goes through, and then they're really cooking. For the growth of BIM users, and this is a real quick explanation of what the users go through and what types of users there are in every office. And so at the beginning of my beginner training, almost everybody is an examiner, and they can basically, they understand Revit, they can open it up, they can look at the drawings, they can print, they can do some annotations, but they're not necessarily contributors yet after the beginner stage. Once we go through intermediate training, then everybody's on the same playing field as being a contributor. And by contributor, I mean they're actually starting to model elements, they're adjusting things, they're creating details, modifying schedules, and these are things that are contributing to the project, and they're sort of individual things. And then after the advanced training, we hope to bring everybody up to the producer stage, and that's where the people who are done with advanced training can take a project and they can be in charge of everything with it, from the drawings to the model to all of the deliverables, everything within the software. And so this is where you start to have some people drop off. So we try to get everybody to that middle ground of producer. And then after that, the individual personalities within your office are going to either go further or remain in production. So the people, and you probably know who they are in your office, are going to move on and want to start, they have the passion to explore more things about building information modeling. And so they'll start looking at rendering and clash detection and sustainable analysis, things like that, other tools in the software, and they'll explore more. And then once they've reached that, there's going to be a few more of them that go even further to leaders, and they start to become the BIM managers in your office. They're about deploying project standards and BIM execution plans and working with everybody in the office to bring up the knowledge base so that the teams are working together really well. And that's sort of a quick overview of some of the stuff I talk about with executives when I do my managing BIM users session.
I think one last point, just to sort of tack on before we'll open it up for any questions, is just about contracts and about your relationships with your both contractors and, of course, consultants. Just to sort of get that out, sort of making, if you're trying to educate executives about BIM, they need to understand that, you know, maybe their contracts are going to have to be a little bit different. They're going to, their RFPs to their consultants are going to have to set the expectations for, you know, for whether they're going to be requiring, you know, BIM models from their consultants, and then also talking to their clients about whether they're going to be using contractors that can work and do digital coordination. So those are just a couple extra things. I think we had discussed maybe we would open it up to see if there are any questions about educating executives about them.
I was in a firm for a few months this past year where they had Revit installed, and it crashed their computer every day. And so it became apparent that there were these IT people that knew a lot about computers but knew nothing about Revit. And then there were the users who knew a lot of things about Revit but really nothing about the capability of the computers. And it was, for the duration I was there, it was never discovered what exactly was the problem, other than it appeared to be it was in the amount of computer power they had. We had a whole team of 6 people doing a Revit project, and it was.
Were executives involved? How did they get involved to help resolve the issue?
Other than panic to get the IT people involved, and there were IT people coming up and looking at the computers, servers, and things like that. But about, just seriously, every day at 4 o'clock, the computer servers crash.
This section is about executive input.
Yeah.
How did executives help deal with it?
There was panic, and that try to get the IT people involved, and try to then let supposedly the experts get it resolved. The next step would be to seriously take a serious look at the computer system. That part I never saw.
Okay. Anybody else has any input on like what they've done to help executives kind of get it? This would be a time.
I think maybe to her point though, about executives in that case. I mean, it just goes to the one question of, you know, just sort of establishing that maybe, your computers, system and your IT folks need to be sort of brought up to speed in addition to the architects and designers that are working in your firm. And that, depending on whether you have an international firm and you want to work across different offices, again, there are other considerations that leadership might have to consider about investing more money in their infrastructure to make sure people can work across offices in BIM and so that their computers don't crash.
You have to make it fun. I think when you're dealing with upper management, people who are, that firm is business, right? That makes money. And this has to go to, sorry, I've got one in my pocket. Get one in his pocket again. What was I talking about? Quantitative, right? It's got to be quantitative. You have to be able to kind of spell this out in dollars and cents, right? And I'll use what we went through in this office as an example where we had a project that was so large that machines simply couldn't physically handle it. And we begged, borrowed, and steal to get enough money so that we could go out, buy extra RAM, and then do a real quantitative analysis with a machine that, was set up the old way that crashed, and then a machine that was set up the new way, and actually sit there with a watch and time things and say, it takes X amount more hours per week or per month. I did it for a whole quarter, and we're able to look at it and say, look, over the course of a year, making this small $6,000 investment will give us, $139,000 more to our bottom line because these machines will work faster, and therefore the people on them work faster, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what gets people's heads turned, and that's how you have to talk to those upper levels. You can't be like, oh, well, we think it'll be a lot faster, it'll be better if we had more RAM. It's easy to be qualitative. It takes a little more work to be quantitative, but that's what gets results.
We have this in our office, and we have the same thing in our office, and we had our IT people just run a check on everybody's computer, what the specs were. Autodesk gives recommended specs for how to operate Revit, and you might find out that people with the strongest computers aren't using Revit, and they aren't really utilizing their computers up to the highest standards. So you have someone with 16 gigs of RAM and great processing, but they're using Word docs and nothing else. So if you have a good documentation of what you have in your office, you can better direct it who should be using what. So that can also help. Plus, yeah, you might just have to invest in better computers.
So a person like that should not even put them off on a computer system, and then that computer, whatever it took to run that computer, gets freed up for the other people that are using.
That computer in our office is sitting in the corner, no one's using it. So we're going to now put it to the guy who uses most of it.
Just give it to the intern. So different topic, different from this question, but you said you train executives on kind of how to look at BIM in their corporation. So two questions, kind of a two-parter. First, is it just architecture firms that you've been speaking with? And if not, what other types of firms do you work with? And then the other part is, what has been the results? Like these guys that have been sitting in your training classes, do they go back and have to, overhaul their company? What is the result of that leadership, and what are some stories maybe that you've seen or experienced as a result of speaking to executives?
Okay, so to answer the first question, the training that I do, I've done for construction companies as well as architecture firms, so it's not limited to just architecture firms. But the majority of what I've done is with architecture firms. And the feedback typically during the training sessions, because the session runs as 3 one-hour sessions for the executives, and within each hour there are a lot of really interesting questions that are asked by the executives about things that you wouldn't expect. A lot of times they're asking about this training mindset and what the users are going to be doing, and trying to understand how their staff is going to be affected by all of this training, because it's a huge change from going from 2D to going to building information modeling. And so to really try to get their heads around that. The biggest thing probably is because most architects previously, they're coming out of school, they already know how to draw. They can use a pencil and paper pretty easily. You didn't have to train anybody to do that. AutoCAD was kind of a on-the-job training thing. There wasn't a whole lot of people going out to get somebody to come in and train their entire staff. But now with BIM, that's sort of what's happening. And so that mindset for the executives is kind of hard to put. They really just want to install Revit and have somebody use it and have them understand it. That's what they want. And so questions that get asked during it are really about what that mindset is. What I have seen is a BIM manager get put into place in between the staff that's getting trained and the executives, so that there's somebody who has enough experience to be able to talk to the Revit user, but also talk to the IT guys as well as the executives all at once. And so the BIM manager really is sort of a newer employee or staff member that I think a lot of firms are starting to go to, and I've seen 2 of the firms that I've trained hire somebody on after I've discussed some of this stuff with them. And really the BIM deployment and the BIM execution plan is something you really need somebody, you know, sort of streamlining your process throughout your whole company almost full time. Otherwise, it's not going to get done. It's going to be done, you know, on the side, and you know, you'll have meetings every couple of weeks with committees, and nothing will ever really get done. So that's sort of the bigger benefit that I've seen from some of it.
So we've got BIM execution plan queued up. So maybe we should move on to the next topic.
Yep. So the next thing we were going to talk about was project team workflow, and I guess I want to start with saying, you know, we were talking about this last week about teaching people about sort of essentially how to work in Revit. You know, what's the workflow? How does it work? And I have queued up a video from one of our authors, Brian DeYoung. But before I show that, I think we should also talk about maybe sort of start at the bottom with the young folks, young people that are coming in to the profession, and maybe who do have some BIM skills and knowledge. And I think what's interesting, and maybe this is just sort of a point for sort of discussion later on, is really I think there's a common idea that young folks coming in, that there's no way they can effectively contribute to a Revit model or to sort of a BIM workflow because they don't have the experience of putting buildings together. And I think what's really interesting, if you sort of go through this, you know, many of you probably know are working in BIM, and you know that when you're working in 3D, you're essentially putting the building together in a virtual environment. So you're putting it together digitally. And many students who are coming from, you know, from university and then they're coming into the profession, and if they have experience in BIM, that means they've been essentially putting buildings together digitally for maybe a year, maybe a couple of years. And so in many ways, I guess I sort of have the opinion that it's a really good time to be a young architect coming into the profession, because you know the 10 or 15 or however many years you think it takes to become a competent architect, I think is now dramatically reduced, because young people are putting together buildings in the computer. They're not doing abstract drawings. They're not doing 2D detailed drawings out of the gate. Instead, they're actually putting buildings together, and I think that that experience actually translates into learning how to become an architect a lot faster. I was just talking with one of the directors at the CAF. They do the Chicago Architecture Foundation, and they do a lot of high school programs. And this is exactly what we were talking about, how, and it's really interesting that high school students, with the technology that we're all talking about, well, they're talking about it too. And so they're getting the benefit of, I mean, imagine that. You know, we're all talking about it, and we're in the profession now. Imagine if you're in high school and you were digitally putting buildings together. In fact, it's sort of funny. I went and I had the opportunity to give a presentation at my alma mater, at my high school alma mater, Prospect High School, which was really kind of funny. But after this presentation, I was talking to the teacher, and one of his students, who was probably a junior in high school, he had a section cut through a green roof, and he was asking the professor, or his teacher, not professor, his teacher, he was asking him about the depth of the various slices in that green roof. So he's sort of thinking about how that building goes together, and he's 16. So again, for those of you that either scoff at the young professionals that are sort of coming up, or that have heard others say, young people, they're never going to be able to, how are we going to, we don't have red lines to give them. How are they going to, get into a BIM model? I think it's the exact opposite. I'd love to know if after we're done yapping, we can sort of get your thoughts.
Yeah, and one thing I'll add to that is the younger generation coming into the profession sort of has the advantage of being the younger generation, so they can ask the questions without getting the looks from the senior people, like, why don't you know that? And so a lot of times they'll be putting together something and not understand how it goes together and bring it up to a senior architect and say, look, I'm not sure how this turns the corner the way you drew it. I tried to build it and I can't get it to work. And the senior architect will look at it and go, you know what, you're right. Let's redesign that detail so that it works appropriately. And a lot of things that seem sort of obvious then turn into design problems and better solutions because of it. And so I think the questions that get asked by the younger architects are actually very, very valuable to any project team.
Do you teach that in the workflow? And when you're teaching a team, do you teach ask these questions?
Well, I actually think that to the point of workflow and how do you, I mean, it's essentially the question of how do you engage young people in the process of working a BIM model. And it's, well, instead of giving them red lines that are 2D, you give them red lines that are 3D, right? Because they can think and work in 3D. You know, a project that I worked on at Gensler, we had, in fact, it was interesting. The youngest people on the team, they were the ones that were figuring out the geometry of the building. They were the ones that you weren't giving them dumb bathroom details. Instead, you were actually giving them, okay, here's a component, right? Go build this. Here's the plan and the section, the elevation of the component that we need. Go build it. Or here's the curtain wall that we need. Here's what, you know, here's the details. Take the details and go build it. And they're perfectly capable of doing it. In fact, you know, exceptionally capable of doing it. But to move on a little bit, I wanted to talk in terms of workflow. The obvious thing to talk about is a BIM execution plan. And since we're up here, Brad and I talking about sort of talking through the lens of our, I guess you could say, the way we are trying to train architects right now. So Black Spectacles, right? We have a number of tutorials on Revit. We have 2 tutorials that are currently in production. They're both with Brian DeYoung, who's an architect here in Chicago at SOM. They're not done and they're not out of production yet. They will be by the beginning of August. So I did a rough cut of Brian's introduction to a BIM execution plan that I thought maybe we could listen to.
So the very first thing that you need to do is define the project. You need to figure out how you're going to execute this using Revit. And the most common method for doing that is creating something that's commonly used as a BIM execution plan. Sometimes it's referred to as a BIM management plan. Basically, this is a document. It's just a Word file that you type up, or an Excel file, or a combination of the two put together, that basically explains how you're going to approach this project using Revit, using BIM. For many governmental agencies or institutions, this is a required document of the contract. This is something that you have to do as part of the project. And this document basically does, when you really get right down to it, it does 3 things. Number 1, it defines the BIM scope of work. What is going to be done in BIM on that project? The next thing that it does is defines the BIM responsibilities and procedures for everybody on the team. So it defines what the architect's responsibilities are, what the structural engineer's responsibilities are, all of the various people that are involved, what are they going to be doing on this project. And it also explains what procedures you're going to use on this project. What are your coordination procedures? How are you going to exchange models? How are you going to exchange information? All of that is spelled out very clearly in this, what's called a BIM execution plan. It also, and the third thing that it does is it establishes project standards. So it establishes things like your project browser organization. It establishes how you're going to name your sheets, the sheet list. It establishes how you're going to name your views. It establishes line weights, object styles. All of those standard things that make the documents look the way that they look is defined in this BIM execution plan. Now, there's a couple of different places where you can find BIM execution templates that you can then build upon. The 2 most commonly used ones are one from Penn State University, and the second is from Indiana University. Both of these universities have developed a template by which you can take that template and make a BIM execution plan. Now, personally, I have written several of these over the years, and I have used the Penn State template more than the Indiana University template. And both of these templates are very extensive. They have pages after pages of information for you to fill out and complete in order to generate one of these documents. However, you shouldn't just open up this template and feel like you have to complete every single section of it. There's a lot of things in these templates that I feel go way overboard there's a lot of things in these templates that go way overboard that are not really necessary. And I don't believe on any BIM execution plans that I've ever written, I have written them exactly according to the template. I've always changed them a little bit here and there, usually leaving certain sections of them out, simply because it's just too much information that nobody's really going to read anyway. But if you need to create one of these BIM execution plans, you can go to one of these websites, and that is a good place to start.
So, so that's sort of Brian's overview on a BIM execution plan. You're welcome to add anything you'd like to that. I think the other thing to talk about as it relates to sort of explaining or teaching sort of a workflow in BIM is really about setting up templates, which is what our other course gets into, and how you can really utilize that to establish the workflow. And by workflow, which is sort of a generic term, how are people in the office actually working together? How are people setting up sheets? What line types are they using? Are they naming things, in an absurd way or in a consistent way? Or how are they organizing their views, et cetera? So I think setting up project templates is essential. In addition to the BIM execution plan, is another sort of essential part in talking about your process for working on a project. Anything else you'd add to that?
No. Well, I think that was a pretty good explanation of the BIM execution plan. I think the other thing to keep in mind with your Revit workflow for starting a project is really all of the players that are involved and making sure that they're all on board with it. So, any of the contractors or consultants that you're going to have, that they understand what your BIM execution plan is and that they're also working towards that same goal.
Well, apologies for interrupting, but just to add, that's very, very, very architect specific. And just the experience that I've had are very, very project specific, so it does involve everybody. Whereas if you don't have the collaboration from the other people on the other teams, go ahead and do a BIM execution plan for your own scope of work, and it will have value, but it will have tremendously more value if you're collaborating with the other people who you are sharing files and you're handing it off and you're all working together on the project. So.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a huge part of it, and I do talk a little bit about that. Not necessarily the BIM execution plan, but having everybody on board and the sort of collaboration and coordination that happens.
Go ahead.
Do I need this little thing?
Okay,
So I'm just letting you know I've seen most of the major BIM execution plans out there, and they, for the most part, all state the use of Revit as the environment. There's no talk of Navisworks or coordination or anything like that, right? So I think that, as you're going out there and educating people, maybe you could help them understand that, we can't really build from Revit, right? Like, it doesn't work that way.
Right, and for the most part, the BIM execution plan is limited to the software, whether it's Revit or FormZ or any of the other BIM softwares that architects are using to create the BIM. The contract is where you're sort of determining who's using what software and how they're using it. Right. So, like, if you're using Navisworks to go out in the museum, we use Navisworks. We didn't put any dimensions on the drawings. They use Navisworks to get all the dimensions for all the geometry. Right. And that was a separate thing from the BIM execution plan. So it is something that needs to be a part of your integrated project delivery process, but it's not necessarily part of the BIM execution plan.
Right. Like the last BIM execution plan I saw, and this is a large project in Chicago, hundreds of millions of dollars. the BIM execution plan called for Revit and Revit MEP, right?
Mhm.
And then it spelled out the LOD and the 400 and 300 and everything was real. And then it actually stated that then the builders are going to come in and create a Navisworks model with real fabrication and real content software, right? And coordinate. I mean,
Right.
do you see my point?
I do.
Like, what was the whole point of that whole BIM execution plan then? What did that do?
To your point, the BIM execution plan is really for the firm that's doing the building information model. So they're setting it up and they have expectations for things, but that BIM execution plan is not part of the contract. So they can say that you're going to do whatever they want to say, and it's not necessarily true. So it's really just an internal document for the firm or for the company that's going to be building the model. The contract is where that information gets laid out for what you're actually going to do, and whether that's in the contract or not is a different story. And so that's definitely something that when the contractor is involved from the very beginning, there's and it may be included in that BIM execution plan. There's a better understanding and more collaborative effort there.
And I would say I've multiple times, I know you probably have gotten the results of what people have done with the BIM execution plan, and as you talked about, there's a lot that you just kind of delete, and you may be missing, because I frequently start with the Penn State BIM execution plan from a whole project view representing all of the players, from the fabrication to the guy designing it and dreaming it up. And I mean, we specifically talk about this is getting done in Revit, this is getting done in Navisworks. Don't, you're going to do a level this coordination in Revit, and then don't spend another week trying to coordinate it. We'll take it from there. Or yes, please spend that extra week. Don't give us junk. That whole level of conversation. What's more valuable, time? Who do we have? And it actually is extremely valuable. So I think it may be when you open up the obnoxiously huge, large, very helpful document to start cutting. What do you cut? It depends on what you're looking at, I think, when it starts. And it's very valuable from the whole project perspective. So.
Actually, we're running out of time here for this discussion, although it's lively. We might be able to come back to this. Let's move on to the next topic. And then for the next round of questions, Dave, if you could bring the microphone around and back a little bit, too.
We're seeing a comment from one of the guests here, somebody from SOM saying U.S. Army Corps requires a BIM execution plan as an attachment to the contract, thus binding. So to the point about how relevant or how much teeth does the BIM execution plan, it just depends on the project and folks involved and maybe how that's set up. We're going to talk about project managers and sort of empowering them to get the most out of the model.
Yeah, so to talk a little bit about this, this is just a quick slide to give you an overview of what we're going to talk about. But the big thing for project managers is planning. You have to plan in order for this to work. And the BIM execution plan is part of it, understanding deliverables, deadlines, and the drawings. One of the things that I think is the most valuable thing, and I'm going to show you an example in a minute, is the cartoon set, which is done by hand with a pen and a piece of paper. You can do it in Revit, but the way I've always done it is just by printing out a plan in Revit and then redlining it for where I think I need details and setting up my set. And this is something you really need to do as a project manager before you start doing your working drawings. And it's really important because in Revit, if you just start making drawings and then you need to make some references to the correct locations, Revit's really clunky with how it sets all of that up. So if you've created some plan details in the wrong location, it's going to show up on the overall plan instead of the blow-up plan, or it's going to show up on some random section at the very beginning of the building rather than on a blow-up detail section later on. So planning is very important so that when you lay this all out in Revit, it gets laid out correctly and you're not doing any rework. The process itself really has to be understood as well. So seniors are going to be doing some sketches, or anybody who's not in the model that has to do work needs to do their sketches, hand it to the juniors to input it, build the model. There's going to be some holes in that model. The juniors are going to find those holes when they don't understand how something's going together. They're going to come back to the seniors and say, look, this doesn't work. How can I make this work? And then they work together, and there's sort of this mutual mentorship that happens between juniors and seniors where the juniors are sort of helping out the seniors understand the building more completely, and the seniors are helping juniors understand how buildings go together. So to sort of to bring that to and show an example, this is just a view of a classroom area where I did a quick cartoon set for this very specific location, and you can see I just redlined it with where I thought all the details needed to be taken, threw them all on some sheets, laid them out, and then sent this over to the junior and said, here, can you lay this stuff out for me, tee up these sheets so that we can have the beginning of a set going. And then he came back to me and said, you know, you showed that plan on that first sheet, like down here in the corner with a bunch of other views here. And when I really get a plan that we can see and is visible and legible, it's huge. So we need to redo this cartoon set and get it, you know, better. So this is the sort of thing I'm talking about with planning. Once you get into actually doing this stuff in Revit, it's going to be much more time saving if you do this all up front and get these views all set up, which means you've already got a majority of the building built in the model. One thing about the process here, we were given a sketch that said, for this very specific location, which were called the tips of the roots on the museum, we were told to do a 30-degree angle. And so when I built this parapet cap, I built it at 30 degrees from the wall, because that's what my assumption was based on the detail I was given. The structural engineer came back, and he had built it 30 degrees parallel to the ground plane. And so when I brought it in, we looked at it and went, there's a problem here. So we went to the senior who designed the original sketch and said, hey, how do we deal with this? How do you want to deal with it? And he said, well, it's actually going to be better for them to build it if the top is flat instead of angled. Let's do the detail differently. So he drew up a new detail for me so that I could model it correctly and send it to the structural engineer and say, here, let's fix this before we get out in the field and you're, you know, spending all this extra time framing up this angle on the top of this thing that's not really that great. So this is sort of the workflow that really, really helps out a lot with that. Managing the expectations, too, of what your deliverable is really, really important. One thing I want to point out with the museum, we got about halfway through construction, and it was a fast-track project, so they had gotten half of the exterior done, but they were still looking for interior information for bidding. This is a paint schedule that was taken directly from Revit, exported into Excel. And it's a paint schedule that the architects produce. And what that means is the contractor actually asked the architect, how much paint, how many square meters of paint do you have in the building, all the different types of paint. This is information they asked the architect to provide. Well, this is a Canadian project. It's a little bit less adversarial up there. The architects were like, sure, we'll give you that information. And then they came to us and said, how do we do this? And it was kind of like, if we would have known this ahead of time, this would have been a whole lot easier because we could have built this correctly from the beginning. So we had to go back and figure out, now we have to copy every wall twice, turn it into a 1 millimeter paint wall on both sides of the wall, go through the whole building and do that. And when we did, we turned out there was 24,365 square meters of paint, and there were 15 different types of paint on the walls. How accurate is that? I think it's at least 95% accurate. I wouldn't bet my soul on it, but it was a pretty accurate takeoff. It took a lot of time to do it. So knowing what your deliverable is going to be is very important. And the next slide here is also another thing that they asked for, which was a drywall takeoff. And we went through the building and created these 3D views to point out all of the different types of drywall and how to show, some of this drywall was up higher than a normal person could get. So they were going to have scaffolding to get up there and put the drywall up. So we spent a lot of time, we spent weeks creating these documents so that the contractor could have this. And if we would have known ahead of time we were doing that, it would have definitely scaled down those 3 weeks into a couple of days to make sure that we planned correctly for it. So that's a really huge portion of getting, you can get this information out of the model, but you need to plan for it ahead of time.
And then, so there's two things I would add. So if you're a project manager, or if you're trying to set up a project manager for success who's working on the BIM project, there's two things I think that are key. One is we talked a little bit about this setup, right? If you're working with someone who's a seasoned professional, who maybe this is new to, they have certain they probably have expectations for how frequently and how rapidly the production staff is capable of generating drawings. And as we all know from the famous, diagram that we all see about BIM, the workload is shifted so that there's a higher quantity of work that's required at the beginning, meaning that when your project manager is expecting, a really nice set of drawings 2 weeks into the project, if it was a CAD project, maybe that's reasonable. But if it's a Revit project, maybe either those set of drawings at 2 weeks are going to be half as detailed than they would have otherwise been, or it's going to take 3 or 4 weeks to get to that point. So it's really about setting up the expectation that, hey, it's going to take a lot. It's going to take more time to get the model built and for you to get comparable drawings at the outset. Of course, we all know that the value that you get from that extra investment of time you see later on. So it's really about sort of communicating that. That can be streamlined through templates that you set up, right? So you can gain speed if your project team has good templates set up. So you can sort of just get busy modeling, and then it's really easy because maybe plans are already set up on sheets, so it's a lot easier to sort of move forward. So that's one piece. The second piece is about contracts. Don't forget that if we're talking about a BIM execution plan, we're talking about how we're going to coordinate with our consultants. We generally control those contracts. So it doesn't do us any good to say we're working in Revit and issue the exact same contract that says absolutely nothing about BIM to all of our consultants. So it's essential that your project managers, in order to really, as we all know, get the benefit out of working in BIM, everyone needs to be working in BIM. Otherwise, it's it's a good rendering tool. So setting that up at the outset is essential. And then also, they're the ones that have, pretty commonly they're working directly with the client, so they have the client's ear. So they're the ones who can make sure that the clients understand the benefits of working in BIM, so that they're the ones who can pick a contractor who's also going to coordinate in BIM, right? Because again, it all sort of falls apart if you don't kind of get to that point. So those are the things I guess I would add to that. We're probably going over on time here.
Yeah, let's move right into this last section, and then we can have a free-for-all question and answer discussion once this last section is over.
Which is a good lead-in. Do you have slides, Brad? Or?
I do. I'm going to start. Okay. I think I start with this one, then you go into some of the stuff that you had. So with digital coordination with your consultants and your contractors, there's a lot of things involved with what that says. So the big thing is to understand that does need to be a process in place for receiving files from your consultants, for delivering files to your contractors who are also going to be needing that information, how it's going to be stored. This process needs to be set up with everybody involved, whether you're using a Revit server, or whether it's something that each individual office is building their model and then uploading it to the architect, and the architect is sort of merging them all together, or if they're all sending them to the contractor and the contractor is taking them all together in Navisworks. That process needs to be there. Specifically for architecture firms and consultants, I recommend a lot of times to the firms that they take those files, clean them up, because they're going to get them. There's going to be sheets in them. There's going to be views they don't need. There's going to be all kinds of stuff that doesn't pertain to what they're doing. Same thing when they send them out. Make sure you get rid of all of the random 3D views that so-and-so created, and make sure it's as streamlined as it can be, because you want those files to be as small as they can, because they'll get big fast. I know it never happens, and it's something I always recommend to everybody. Yeah, it's not very common, but we did it on the museum, and I think it helped a lot. That those files, when cleaned up, when you added them all together, were about 1.2 terabytes. I mean, it was crazy. So
developing ability to be able to develop a little button that you can push to automatically do all of that, you would need a lot of it.
There are some plugins that do some of that stuff.
For those of you listening online, we had the suggestion that if anyone wants to spend some money investing in developing a button that would automatically clean. I think this is from the contractors in the group, if I'm not mistaken, and consultants, so that you could make a lot of money with cleaning up the Revit models.
So the other thing that I really recommend is working with contractors and not against them. If you've got tools that are better than what the contractors or the subcontractors have to determine something, don't just sit know you have the tool and like watch them struggle through trying to figure something out, like help out. Jump in there and say, look, I can do this in 2 hours, and I know it's going to take you 4 days to figure it out. So let me help you out there, and I'll show you a DWF later on of something we did to do exactly that. And understanding what the expectations are from the contractors is what's going to make your project successful. You need to have them on board, and they need to tell you what they're expecting, and you need to understand what they're expecting so that you can give them that deliverable the way that it needs to be done. So I think you've got some. I don't know.
Where's your folder?
Right there. I made your slides.
So I think what I want to contribute to this is maybe just a little bit of just my experience, and to talk a little bit about coordinating through the design process. This is a project I worked on. As you can see, it was all done in BIM from an architectural perspective, including the furniture. And then this was probably in 2006. We had the opportunity to have our structural engineer work in BIM as well, so you can see that there is some steel in this. So this was sort of a prototype for actually coordinating through the design process. And it worked pretty well. What's interesting, I think, though, is this. I had, through that course I was talking about, in that master's program at IIT, the Master of Integrated Building Delivery, I had Richard Barrett, who's formerly an architect at Gary's office. He presented this hotel he did in Spain. What was really interesting is he talked a little bit about, you don't often hear Gary Project talk about in terms of coordination, but someone asked a question about, how do you actually, really get this thing built? How do you really coordinate the steel? How do you really coordinate the MEP and all those things? And he said that in a very simple way, that they literally have to coordinate everything digitally before they turn their models over to the contractor. So they literally clash detect everything in the design process, and they do that digitally. And so they deliver the CATIA model, and it's all coordinated. So they literally built the entire thing in the design process, which at the time, I mean, at least in the world that I was in, that wasn't something that you heard a lot about. Maybe you heard about Navisworks, and you heard about contractors coordinating and clashing stuff, but you didn't hear about that design process, which of course is ironic because that's actually what we're supposed to be doing, right? Is coordinating. And in many cases, even though it might have been a BIM model, it was still being coordinated with overlays or a light table or some other sort of now somewhat antiquated techniques. So I thought this was really interesting. And so the next project that I worked on, which was this project for Kohler up in Wisconsin, we had the opportunity actually to try this out. And the reason, so this is not an expensive building. It's a very actually inexpensive building. And so the client, they wanted to hire, so they hired C.G. Schmidt, a contractor out of Milwaukee, early on. And so they worked with us probably at about schematic design is when they came on board. And almost simultaneously, they then went and hired an MEP design build contractor. We had an MEP design consultant who had a contract through schematic design, and they were required to deliver, based on our contract, they were required to deliver a BIM model for sort of a schematic level, as were our lighting folks and our structural folks, and of course we were too. So we had something that we were able to kind of coordinate at schematic design, and then since we had a design build subcontractor involved, at the beginning of design development, we were able to take our models, and then they started essentially working with us so that we could coordinate in Navisworks at literally the first part of design development. And so this is a shot inside of that Navisworks model, and it's interesting because the discussion about BIM and coordination so infrequently includes ideas about design and sort of benefits and sort of value from a designer's perspective. And here's a project where it's really inexpensive. So not a stretch for us to have gone with sort of an aesthetic that left everything so you could see it. So you could see all the steel, you could see these industrial sort of lights. Everything was exposed, right, which was a design decision. And so think about the value that coordinating and design development, when you can see all the guts of the building, right? When you can coordinate, when you can determine exactly where that duct's going to be and figure out if it's actually going to be centered between the two beams, or understand the relationship between the plumbing and the ducts and the light fixtures and all these things that you can actually design. So that it's not just about making sure stuff doesn't clash and you save some money. It's actually a part of the design process.
So you're saying this building's like the Frank Gehry building?
Yes, exactly. So what I'm saying is that this is a Frank Gehry eat our dust.
Well, it was just a joke, but that's the point, is that you can get to that level
But that
of
sort of
coordination.
that sort of is the point. In fact, then sort of to two extremes, right? I don't know what the cost per square foot was of that amazing building that they did in Spain. Maybe it was $1,000 a square foot or something. You know, this was like right around 120 bucks a square foot. Like, this is a cheap building that still maintained a high design standard. And, you know, I don't know, I forget when he had that building. It was probably done in like maybe 2005. So, you know, 7 years later, 6-7 years later, in Revit, a piece of software that doesn't cost, what does CATIA cost, $25,000 or something? You know, for a project that's really simple, you know, you can sort of take advantage of that. So I guess that's kind of the point I wanted to make about, I guess we were talking about teaching, right? We were talking about how you would, so I guess the point is it goes back to a lot of the things that we've been talking about, right? It's about setting the table so that if you want to do this, if you want to be able to coordinate digitally, well, then you have to set your contracts up right. You have to make sure you're going to get models from everybody. You have to work with your client. I mean, our client, they understood the value of working in BIM, so they hired a contractor who had experience and who wanted to work in BIM, and then they kind of leaned on them to make sure that they could actually get a BIM model. And it was because of economy. It had nothing to do, from the client's perspective, it had nothing to do with design, right? It's just about economy. But having those things set up and making sure that everyone sort of understands that is kind of key. You had some things you wanted to add, Brad.
Yeah, I'm gonna show some things here. And part of this training thing, the last couple of slides I showed you had to do with some issues with what not to do and how to make sure you plan for the things for what you're not going to do. This is something I think that everybody should do, and what I'm showing here is a DWF that we created. We were tasked with, we went to a meeting where it was the architect, the contractor, and the subcontractor for Spider Lift, which is a product that like zooms around your site. It's got some legs that go out and stabilize the base, and then there's a boom that goes up. And the whole purpose of buying this was to see if we could wash the windows on the building without having to put davit arms up on the roof. And so we had this meeting in different locations just to make sure. a quick picture of it to show you that it is getting built, and it's utilizing BIM, I think, as well as you can.
This is a good time to note that this building is the basis of Randy Deutsch's integrated design book, and it's good to see it at this stage.
You need a new cover.
Yeah, he is
Bradley's key in coordinating that. So
I think that's it. I think those are the 4 topics we wanted to cover. And so for the folks that are online, it's time. It's class at Whole Foods time. Is there anything else?
Anybody in the back there that didn't get a chance that might want to say something?
Yeah, open questions.
So we'll open it. I'm sorry, for everyone who's online, if you have a question, we'll try to pull it up, and then we'll pass the microphone here for maybe 10 minutes or so. And so if you're online and you have a beer, go grab one, as that's what we're all going to do here.
If you're hearing well, grab one.
In talking about the BIM execution plan, one of the key features of that is the file naming and setting up how the project is set up in the project browser. I would imagine that aside from the little out-of-the-box thing that you get, the little piece of garbage that you get from Revit, that there might be some really nice templates out there that, and if we could share that, that would be so awesome, because one of the things that's coming out of this is, as I have really worked with a real team and you work on a project, the reason why you need the plan is because all people have a tendency to work independently and separately in their own way of working. And so before you know it, if you're not using the tool right and you're not using it together, it's just like, it's like crazy.
Do you have templates that are publicly available?
So,
does anybody know if there's a sort of repository or if anyone shared?
There's a wiki that someone was developing. I'm aware of it.
Does anyone know online if there's a good resource?
What about the National Building Standards from Building Smart Alliance? I have a problem with Penn State and/or Indiana all of a sudden becoming the national standard gatekeeper for an industry that someone like Building Smart Alliance might already be in the consensus development on the national BIM
All of
standard.
the people at Penn State and Indiana are part of the Building Smart Alliance. They're just doing that as subgroups.
yeah. But I think, I mean, file naming, ideally, back in Neanderthal, when we had the Mylar sitting in the drawers, you would tend to organize them from the cover sheet down through the set. So the way in which you could do it. Now, with file naming, numerical order trumps alphabetical order. And then if you have the national BIM standards, as well, you got your F sheets, you got your A sheets, and blah, blah, blah. But you need to have this parameter that sets it up where they set in the order that you want. And when we tried to do that on our project, it didn't work out for us. But I mean, that's why, so having that template set up already in advance, so you're working with it is ideal, where you have your sheets organized the way you want them.
I think you'll run into a lot of issues with. I think with the templates being shared, you end up running into a lot of issues in each office wanting to have their own standard applied to that template that everybody's like passing around. And so really what you need is somebody in the office who can adjust the template to what you need it to be. And if they can do that, they can set it up that way from the get-go so that you can certainly pass them around. I know Augie has some that are on there, and a lot of the users on Augie forums, if you just email them, if they've posted something about their template, a lot of them will send it to you. So you can certainly get a hold of one, but you also need to be able to adjust that template as well. And so that's certainly something that comes as part of training if you don't know it already, or if somebody in your office knows it, maybe they can take advantage of that and take control of it.
There was a real intense question online about flashing. Did you guys see that?
Yeah, I think so.
Anybody want to take a crack at that one?
Where did it go? I think it was the top one.
Not flashing, the flange bracing.
Yeah, I think there's a question online. I'm not really sure if it's a question, but it says teaching managers the new way to open a file read-only, known to Reviteers as detached from central, encouraging those that could or should do some QA, QC, go check things that are tougher to verify in 2D, such as looking closely at Z coordinates and all of that stuff. And yet that's a very important thing to let managers who aren't normally in the files and aren't contributing to the files but need to go in and do their quality control, that if they decide they want to go into the file, they need to make sure they do that completely separate from the working file. So you open it detached from central or read-only.
Take their Revit shortcut away and just give them the shortcut to Revit.
Hey guys, did you see there were a couple other questions in the questions panel? I don't know if you guys saw them or not.
Yeah, we're just going to go.
I like the one about executives determining how much work to be done. That's a key issue. Has anybody had to deal with that? People are doing too much detail. You got to figure out ways to rein them in.
So this question, how do executives anticipate the extra upfront work required with Revit models? If I were an executive, I would not want someone doing extra work just because they could. I'm not sure that we're suggesting that it's extra work. Perhaps it's the same amount of work. It's just placed in it's just you do it sooner. I think is sort of the suggestion there. So I mean, because of course we're not. The intent here is of course not that we're doing more work and spending more time, but instead the whole idea is that we're trying to save some time. And whether that time is saved in RFIs or submittals or or fighting through clashes in the field, or whether that's, doing fewer details because you're delivering a digital model or something. The whole point is to be saving time. What are the other questions? Yeah.
Well,
John,
just to piggyback on that a little bit, there is extra upfront work required, obviously, but part of that planning stage is going to be done by the project manager, by a senior architect, and somebody who needs to understand what's getting done. And so setting those guidelines so that you know what's getting done and when is important to making sure nobody's just doing extra work just because they can. So they're not going in and determining, oh, I need a family to show this table exactly the way that it's drawn, so I'm going to build my own custom family. Like that kind of stuff is stuff that's not required and should be definitely limited. And so the way you limit that is to make sure the expectations of the team are to work on things that are required and that are going to be due, and here's the checklist for that, and here's what you work on. So I think this other question was directed towards your project with the MEP design build guy.
Yeah, do I know what software my MEP design build guy used for fabrication purpose? I don't know.
Do you know what the name of the company is?
I cannot remember the name.
Where was it?
It was up in Kohler. They were actually local up there. Yeah. C.G. Schmidt was the general, but the MEP, I don't remember the name of the...
Bruno?
No. For reasons I'll keep to myself, I've forgotten their name. Actually, I mean, I don't know exactly. So I don't know what software they use, but I do know that we were in the same room when we were still, again through the design process. I think they were using what's the is it AutoCAD MEP?
Mm-hmm.
Is it called AutoCAD MEP?
Yeah, that's 3D.
Right, that's 3D, right?
I don't know anybody
right, I know that.
builds from that, though. They're either using QuickPen or they're using Autodesk Fabrication, which used to be called CAD/CAD.
Yeah.
Those are the only two major players.
Right. Yeah, and the bigger thing even to look at, like step back a little bit, is that while I teach Revit specifically, a lot of MEP design build guys don't even want the Revit model from the MEP engineer because they've built it the way that they need to build it to design it, and it's not built the way they need to build it to fabricate it. And so they'll take the information, and it's great to have the model, but they'll have to rebuild it in whatever fabrication software they have. So there is still some interoperability issues within the whole BIM realm on going from software to software, but we're starting that conversation, so that's a good place to be.
Is so important,
right?
Right. That's where I mean, to both of your points, if you all this stuff was figured out at some point, 100 years, 400 years from building, and we figured this stuff out at some point. It's just figured out at a not very cost-effective time,
Right.
and not solved in a very cost-effective way, right?
Right.
And those solutions end up trumping whatever design, parameters we had originally established. Because now you're saying, here's my design, you're screwing around with my design, and on the other side there's $4 million saying your design, sorry, this wins, right?
Right.
So so we're just trying this whole shift that the whole thing doesn't depend on software or technology. It depends on a team approach and collaboration.
Yep, absolutely. And to that point, the MEP engineers as well, and I think I mentioned this even in the book, they're going to have to learn how to design, because they're designing for systems, but they're going to have to learn how to design aesthetically. So they're designing for the system and understanding all the pieces and parts of the systems, but their drawings have always been 2D drawings, and they get coordinated in the field. And when you get to having to coordinate them ahead of time in the model, then there's some design that's aesthetic design that has to be done by the engineers before it goes to the contractor, before it gets into the field. Now, I'm not saying that engineers can't do it and that they don't design aesthetically, but historically, most of the engineering drawings I've seen have all been line drawings that say the size of whatever piece of information they're trying to convey, but it's not about having it coordinated before it gets to the field. It's about getting it coordinated in the field, and you get your coordinated shops back and you review them and make sure everything's fine. Now you're trying to do it in the computer ahead of time to make sure it's done properly, so you're not hitting that issue where it's
Dave Garcia online is saying that that's what we do. We're trying very hard to get that process better and making progress. Thumbs up, Dave. Good. Thank you.
Well, thanks to everybody, Marc and Brad particularly. And David Ivey was busy bringing all of us up, and I wanted him to say a few things about the Andre and some of the